There's no doubt that for many of us, JRPGs, whether they be action, strategic or traditional, are our happy place, a serene Eden of endless bodacious fruits that we delight in for hours on end. Well, some of that fruit isn't as delicious as you may think. In fact, it's laden with imperfections that just keep rearing their head. And the more JRPGs I play, the more I realise the common issues that grind my gears as if it's sewn into the DNA of this genre. Here are 7 things that annoy me in JRPGs. Now for the most part, this first one is quite rare. Saying that, it doesn't take away from the
seething vitriolic anger I feel when it happens.
Sorry. My first pet peeve in JRPGs relates to cheap mechanics. Now when I say cheap mechanics, I don't mean powerful abilities that decimate a team as a simple bracket, as in many cases you can counteract these by understanding patterns or reading enemy tells. Abilities that allow you the opportunity to come up with a counter strategy are a-okay in my book. What I'm talking about are the moves that atomize your team down to puddles of conscious goo without any warning, like the dreaded insta-death attacks, or the ones that drop all members to 1 HP, or my personal favourite, the ones that afflict you with a ton of status ailments, giving you no hope of getting back on track. And that's the main crux of my frustration here. They are the ones that happen instantly without any notable tell, meaning you can't prepare, and if you are caught off guard, it becomes very difficult to get control of the fight back in your hands. In summary, they feel unfair. It's artificial difficulty for the sake of a grand fight, but instead of adding positively to the event, it just turns it into a chore, a round of Russian roulette. Falcom are definitely no slouches on this front. There were several in Trails in the Sky second chapter that really hit me at points. Still love the game, but oh boy, when those fights come around again, I'm switching to easy mode. Now I wager this next one might ruffle some feathers, but I don't understand the appeal at all. It's random encounters. I would really like people to explain how random encounters add to an experience for them. Does it add a sense of tension or surprise? Does it keep you constantly on guard? For me, they're so often just an annoyance, especially if the encounter rate is too high. A good example of this problem exists in what should be a very relaxing game, and that is Rhapsody, a musical adventure. My word, forget about playing the trumpets, they were smoking from them when they tune the algorithm here. It's as if they knew the game itself was crazy short, so they had to come up with any method they could to prolong it. I remember barely walking 5 steps before hitting another encounter at points, and to my knowledge, there was no way to reduce it either. For me, having enemy sprites on the map is just superior in every way. If a player wants to fight, they can do that. If they want to avoid the battle, they can do that too. In short, it gives more control to play the way you want, and how is that ever a bad thing? While I can tolerate random encounters, I've never been a fan of them, and if it's just slightly overtuned, it really starts to grind on my overall time with a game. Oh, did we mention the word grind? Right, next one is necessary grinding. I guess you can say difficulty spikes that kind of meld into this one as well. You can try and convince me all you want, but in my eyes, if a game requires the player to grind at any point to advance the main story, then it is an indicator that the game itself has poor progression. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not referring to small leaps and levels from point to point, or games that expect you to be slightly below the level of a boss like, say, SMT5. That's part of progression, and it adds to the challenge, which at that point I feel is fair. What I'm referring to though is when a game has a notable jump, like a gap of 12 to 14 levels from one story marker to the next, something that only can be circumvented by going out of your way to make up the difference. Again, it comes down to player control and choice. If the player wants to grind and become overpowered because, for example, they enjoy the combat or just want an easy time of it later on down the line, then fair enough. Heck, I did that in Dragon Quest XI because it was just a blast to set the stage and reap a reward of 6 to 7 levels in one swoop. I never needed to grind in DQ11, the game's natural progression was good enough that I was fine at pretty much every point, even during the fairly notable spike in difficulty come Act 3, but it never forced me to go out of my way. And thankfully, many JRPGs are decent in this regard, as long as you're not actively avoiding every fight you see and you're keeping your standard equipment up with the curve. I can't recall too many that have forced me to grind against my will, but when it does happen, it drives me insane. Speaking of driving me insane, you know that feeling of decking out a character only for them to suddenly leave because the plot compels it? Yeah, my next annoyance is that one. I can't count the amount of times I have donned my best threads on a party member only for them to give me a peace see ya 30 minutes down the line. Tales of Vesperia is a good example here, multiple characters who will leave you, albeit for maybe 2 to 3 hours at a time. Still annoying though. Trails of Cold Steel is another one with the field exercises, most likely necessitated through the size of Class 7 itself. I get it, it's meant to give more depth to the characters. You can't have all your cast together if there's some grand reveal involving them somewhere down the line, but I just can't stand getting caught out by this. And then to add further salt to that festering wound, you still gotta deck them back out when they inevitably return. Anyway, next up is multiple endings. Now, I don't have anything against multiple endings as a concept. In many cases, I've seen them utilised very well. For example, I was a big fan of how Cold Steel 4 handled its ending. I won't delve in too heavily there for spoiler reasons, but I appreciated what they went for. My main gripe with multiple endings comes in the potential to miss not only the best sequence of events, but to also forgo a ton of content if you're not aware of the requirements. Made all the worse when said requirements are ludicrously well hidden. I'm looking at you, Tri-Ace. This is exactly what happened when I played Persona 5 Royal. I didn't have a clue about the covenants I had to pursue in order to see the added content. I just went for the blokes and gals who took my fancy, and as a result I missed roughly 30 hours of content with no way of recovering unless I played through the majority of the base story again, which was well over 80 hours anyway. In other words, I played the vanilla Persona 5 without even realising it, and it was only after I checked out walkthroughs post-playthrough that I realised how badly I screwed up. Don't get me wrong, if a game gives me a clear branch I can save at to jump back to at a given point, then I'm all good with that. But when the events themselves are so intrinsically linked in order to get a particular ending, that's when the whole thing becomes archaic. And since we're mentioning multiples, well, this also has that, though not in the same way. I dare say many of us have experienced this one, but I'll be interested to know who actually sees it as a detriment to their experience. I'm referring to multiple boss fights with no checkpoints in between. I get it alright, the developers want to have this grand finale, and what better way to do that than to throw down with your arch nemesis over several grueling phases. But my word, you don't have to screw us over by forcing us to restart should we see the dreaded game over screen. A very recent example stands out to me here, and it's the one thing I didn't like about the game. Everything else I loved, but Xenoblade Chronicles 3 undoubtedly had one of the worst final bosses I've seen in recent memory. A fight that takes far too long, that has unskippable cutscenes in between phases, and punishes you heavily if you see a wipe by forcing you to do it all over again. I got to the final phase of my playthrough before I bit the dust. That took me nearly 30 minutes to get to in the first place when including all the side events. Imagine my shock and horror when I realised Takahashi and Monolith Soft would only let me pass with a perfect run. I can't repeat the expletives I used at that point for fear of demonetization, but I wasn't pleased. But saying that, these types of multi-phased fights are a dime a dozen, and many times you at least get a checkpoint to restart from, so it's not too common between games. However, this final one pretty much exists in every JRPG, and I consistently dread it. They exist for the sake of an epic finale to set the stage for the apex of your journey and all the trials you have overcome. By the end of it all, I just want to see those credits roll. I'm talking about final dungeons. If I had to rank all 7 of these grievances, Final Dungeons would easily take the top spot. It is the ultimate of the deadly sins for me. In my eyes, Final Dungeons have very little redeeming quality in many cases. So often they are exceedingly long, loaded with traps and puzzles designed to test your patience, and lest I forget the encounters themselves along the way. 3 Final Dungeons really stand out to me to demonstrate this point. The Tower of Kagutsuchi from SMT3 Nocturne, the Reverie Corridor from Cold Steel 2, and the mother of all crap, Reina from Tales of Arise. Let's just delve in a little bit to Reina, because my word, I hated it. It was the epitome of everything I loathed in Final Dungeon design, wrapped into one big clusterfuck. Damaged sponge enemies? Check. Ungodly in length? Check. Diverging paths to nowhere? Check. And the cherry on top, a gauntlet of mini-bosses right near the end, just so you can unlock a shortcut back to the entrance, most likely when your resources have already been depleted as well. What in the world were they thinking with this dungeon? And it really sucks, because I enjoyed Arise for the most part. I actually liked the developments later in the game, but it took so much away from the overall positive perception I had up to that point. Arise was a great experience, but it could have and should have ended far better, and the fault lies entirely with this abomination they decided to put at the end. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.